Hello, and welcome to Odaacity with your hosts Ayantu and Siyade. Here at Odaacity, we bring you informed and diverse discussions on the most contentious issues that matter most. The Odaacity podcast is a forum for deliberation, fresh ideas, and critical thinking on current affairs. Today, Ayantu and Siyade reflect on the ongoing protests in Ethiopia, the international community's reactions, and the possibilities of indigenous and modern social governance. Welcome, Ayantu. How are you today?
Good, thank you. I'm excited to get talking about this because you and I have been talking about the protests for over a year, so I'm excited to finally get recording on this.
Yeah, and maybe we want to explain to our listeners how we came up with this idea to have more points of view on the discussions that are pervasive right now in Oromo issues.
Sure. I think you and I have been talking about having a diverse range of voices weighing in on the most important issues of our time, both in the diaspora and regarding what's happening in Ethiopia to the Oromo community, but also to larger Ethiopian issues. I think, especially right now, there's a lot of talk about what's happening, but I feel like the voices aren't necessarily as diverse as they could be. And we would like to add to the range of discussions that are happening currently.
Let's just jump into it. So back in 2014, we saw the first wave, relatively first wave of the Oromo protests. And, the Oromo situation has been a state of grievance for centuries in Ethiopia. Do you want to talk about a little bit about how we arrived to this moment?
Yeah, I think this is a good point. This is a good starting point, actually, because I think a lot of people think that the Oromo protests started November of 2015. But for anyone who really knows a little bit about Ethiopia, that's not the case. The Oromo people have had major issues with the Ethiopian state around, economic exploitation, social and cultural exclusion for decades. And 2014 is maybe the latest expression of that. After the 2014 protests, we see a lot of people were killed. There was a lot of hundreds of people were arrested, dozens of people were disappeared. There's a Human Rights Watch has documented on this, and the government didn't do anything about it. The government attacks the people, but doesn't actually prosecute the killers of innocent school children. And then we see, starting from November 2015, we've seen this ongoing protest across Oromia. Now, what makes it different from the 2014 protests is that this has happened in multiple places across the region. So I am thinking that's what we'll talk about today, but we want our listeners not to forget that this is not. The Oromo protests didn't just start. They are not just an expression of the master plan or some one factor issue.
That's right.
They exist in a much, much larger context.
And we also encourage our listeners who may not know of Oromo history or the existence of Oromos, even for that matter, to just do some preliminary searches on Oromo and kind of fill themselves on the background of what we're talking about today. So
yeah, and we'll also include links to the most important things you need to read to be up to date on the protest. We'll include that in the show notes when we put it up.
Yes. So let's talk about the current situation, where things are at. We've just finished the Olympics, and we saw Faisal Alisa make a demonstrative pose as he crossed the finish line, and this is the moment that we're at. And so if we kind of go backwards, can you reflect on what this moment signifies for you in your interpretation of where we've come in this movement? It almost seems like we're at a point of no turning back as far as the audacity and the fearlessness of all Oromos around the world in the diaspora, back home, that are kind of just pushing forward the rights agenda.
Yeah, I mean, Faisa Lelisa, I don't know. I didn't see that coming. Did you?
I did not see that coming at all.
Faisa Lelisa's protest at the Olympics has received more coverage across the Western world, but just like really around the globe than the Oromo protest ever did in its entire 9 months.
Right, right. I noticed that too, yeah.
Yeah, and the good thing is I feel like a lot of the coverage has been more about, why did this guy do what he did? And it hasn't been all about the person as usually, it tends to be. I feel like within the diaspora community, a lot of the discourse is about how much of a hero he is.
Right.
But then within the international media, the coverage is more about like, why did he do, what he did? Who are the Oromo?
Right.
What's going on with Ethiopia? And I think the coverage, I don't know if you saw, there's also an interview done with his mother and Faisa's wife in their home in Ethiopia. And both of them, his mother is basically like, he should stay. He can't come back here.
Right.
And she sort of has this like disbelief on her face, and she sort of chuckles. She's like, do you really believe the government will let him be if he comes back?
Right.
Yeah. And so I think this Faisa's actions at the right time in this for these protests have brought about huge coverage, but I think it's also because of all the work that has been done up to this point by the protesters in Ethiopia.
Right.
And by the few coverage that they've received, because there was already a context.
That's right. I mean, yeah.
So we've come. I think that we've come far, because in 2013, the discussions on Al Jazeera was, who are the Oromo? Are they oppressed? What do they want? But nobody is asking who the Oromo are anymore.
Right. Right.
That's a done, settled deal.
Mm-hmm.
Sort of like, in the international context, I don't think anybody is at the moment going to be asking who are the Oromo. That's no longer where we are. So I feel like even that's a huge gain. Right.
Yeah, from obscurity to the world stage, literally, in one gesture. And it was interesting that as I was flying back from El Salvador, I got a Facebook message from a friend over there that shared an article in Spanish that was circulating, on the internet. So, this one gesture has just sort of brought this entire situation onto the world scene. And that was amazing for me. And as I mentioned earlier, just, it just feels like there's so many unprecedented things that are happening right now. And so it's hard to really predict or even wrap your head around what's going to happen next, But I do agree with you that all of the behind-the-scenes work and the struggles and the demonstrations that have been going on since 2015, and the coverage of that, even if it wasn't significant before, now with this Olympic gesture, there is all of this media out there and stories of the resistance, of the protests that people can look back on and know who the Oromo are and what is going on. So, yeah, everything just seems to be sort of building as far as progression and the sense of there's no turning back,
Yeah. No, absolutely. And I think even Ethiopia's allies understand this. The diaspora community has complained a great deal about the silence, the complicity of the Obama administration and other Western countries and their leaders.
Mm-hmm.
But I feel like even they are getting pressed to admit that their ally has gone too far and no one is backing down. The protesters are not backing down. The international media is not backing down in its coverage. So, I mean, I definitely agree. We're at a breaking point.
Yeah. And you raise a good point about this whole idea of U.S. officials sort of condemning. What does that mean when, in one case, you're condemning this country, but at the same time providing them with almost $1 billion per year? And that includes money that finances the military, the same military that is killing people, innocent people. And we know that the U.S., really praises Ethiopia as being an ally in the war against terror. But again, when you look at the linguistics, who are the terrorists? Because then Ethiopia also has this anti-terrorism law, right? So a lot of Oromo activists and opposition leaders under that terrorism law are condemned as being terrorists. I find the whole thing kind of like a circular argument when I see officials go on, for example, Al Jazeera, and they continue repeating the same narrative. To me, that's problematic, and I think we need to be challenging these ideas and these narratives rather than going in circles with these officials and validating their narrow viewpoints.
Yeah, absolutely. It's not necessarily about attempting to appeal to the U.S. to stop, authoritarianism in Ethiopia. I think it's sort of like stop being complicit in the murders of innocent kids.
Right.
Now, I just want to also mention how, there is a certain contradiction to Ethiopia. For instance, the government in Germany doesn't really, they acknowledge that the Ethiopian government is, I'm just using Germany as an example. They acknowledge that the Ethiopian government is authoritarian, is killing its people. It's oppressive in many ways. It's shutting down communication systems. It's kicking out and imprisoning its journalists. But then they turn around and they say, our priority are the thousands of refugees that the Ethiopians are hosting. And my first thought when I read this article that basically made this argument was, what about the millions potentially of refugees that Ethiopia is producing? And so how do you reconcile this idea of Ethiopia as one of the biggest host of refugees?
Right.
But then it also Ethiopia as the producer of one of the biggest refugee populations.
Absolutely.
So there is a lot to contend with there, and no easy answers either.
Right, and I think this again points to the whole framing principle. Where you can frame this country as a hero in the Horn of Africa or a wonderful ally helping against terrorism and all of this, and turning a completely blind eye to what is actually going on. I think we continue to find ourselves in these situations of frustration and despair because we're not, when I say we, collectively, even as humans around the world, around the planet, are not addressing these ways in which these ideologues present problems while maintaining their power and their status quo. So I know, I understand I'm introducing some abstract concepts, but I think it's because we haven't gone there yet collectively as humanity to try to really understand the mechanisms that are keeping us under this oppressive system. Why I am interested in looking at movements and situations around the world is because then you see the common thread.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I really get more excited about, global grassroots solidarity movements for social justice being in solidarity with each other than this sort of like, dear US, dear America, come save us appeal. And I think in the long term, we're going to see more of more positive, sustainable, inclusive change coming out of global grassroots solidarity movements than the sort of state level oriented attempts at change. I think now that's not to say that the nation state is not going to be relevant any longer. I think the nation state probably will remain relevant at least for our lifetime. But I think more and more people are organizing around, these transnational movements that are that are sort of critiquing and creating alternative to the nation state model. Because I think a lot of the times, because what's happening in Ethiopia affects us personally, we tend to act as if what's happening in Ethiopia is happening in a vacuum. But like you pointed out, it's really not. The social justice issues, the economic exploitation issues that are happening in Ethiopia are just one manifestation of the challenges different indigenous, different oppressed groups around the world are facing with the nation state. So I hope that like in future episodes we can get into more parallel movements around the world,
Right.
from which we could look at lessons and models for change. Because one of the things that really interests me is, as someone who's really like an avid reader on like Ethiopian history and particularly the changes that have happened, is that I really don't want to see one dictatorship in Ethiopia be replaced with another,
Right.
as tends to happen again and again in this country's history. And it's like, how do we? I don't think people on the streets of Oromia or on the streets of the Amhara region in Gondar or in Bahrdar are dying so that another ruler can come in to rule over them.
Right.
Like fundamentally, what we need is this sort of large, comprehensive transformation of the political economic landscape, so that everyone could live dignified lives, regardless of their ethnicity, their culture, their religion, their gender, or whatever social classifications we have.
Right. Reading different scholars write about the possibilities moving forward, and reading the platforms of certain opposition groups or alternative groups that are interested in politics inside Ethiopia, inside Oromia particularly. It's exciting and also challenging to grasp what that would look like, looking back at the Gada system. Not saying we're going to go back to Gada in its purest essence and sitting under the trees and all of that and deliberating under the Oda, but there are certain principles within Gada, for example, that can translate into the modern situation that we find ourselves. The emphasis on democracy, like true democracy. And now, again, I know that in the modern world, we have to consider the powers and forces at work in the international and national political scenes. I may be just being nostalgic and idealistic, but I really do think there's a way to pull some of those older traditions into the way that governance happens in the modern world. What are your thoughts on that? Is that just like a pipe dream, or what do you think?
No, I actually don't think that's a pipe dream. I think it's actually quite viable, because what I'm hearing you say is basically like, I think there's a lot of wisdom in the Gada and other indigenous Oromo and other systems in Ethiopia. I think there's so much indigenous wisdom in the various groups in Ethiopia and the way they govern themselves for hundreds of years. I think our instinct is to look at European systems of governance,
right?
European systems of social organization, but I think we have something more relevant and more fertile right there in our own backyard. And again, I think part of the hegemonic Ethiopian identity is that the Gada is not seen as Ethiopian heritage; it's seen as just Oromo heritage because it's been cast aside.
Right.
But I think if people can sort of work over and around and through that hegemonic block, we could all look into the Gada as a system that could be useful for not just organizing like a future nation state or states, but for organizing our own, small and big spaces. So yeah. So definitely not a pipe dream by any measure. I think a lot of African countries have been having this question of decolonization for, several decades.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that the Ethiopian situation has been different, because we've still sort of been dealing and in the shadow of this hegemonic Ethiopian identity and hegemonic Ethiopian history. And I think that's been a huge obstacle to getting a more accurate representation of what we are dealing with when we're talking about the Ethiopian state.
Right.
And one of my hopes, and something that I'm very optimistic about going forward, is that I feel like there's finally an opening to talking about the Ethiopian state, to interrogating its hegemonic nature and the way it has, suppressed and limited the sort of possibilities for how people could be, for coexistence, for learning about each other and having the sort of conversations that need to happen between and among groups of people in that country.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think that the European model is the model that's going to get us there.
So this quote that I love from Fanon is, "Imperialism leaves behind germs of rot which we must clinically detect and remove from not only our land, but from our minds as well." And that's Frantz Fanon. And so when I think of creating alternative paradigms and systems of governance, I think this is a critical moment where we as Oromos can create something totally new and share with the world, at large, that is a synthesis of indigenous wisdom in a modern setting.
Yeah, and I think this is why we're having these conversations on this podcast, because I think there needs to be a place to have these conversations. I have these conversations, with you, and I have them with other people, and of course we have them in these private, semi-private, settings on social media. But I think one of the things I'm excited about with this podcast is that we can continue to have these sorts of conversations, across ethnicity, across gender, and across, ideologies, and have them with as many people as possible. Because I feel like one of the key things that's going to save all of us, from ourselves and from the nation state is gaining some semblance of perspective and mutual understanding, even if we don't agree.
Right.
With the particularities of the arguments or viewpoints presented.
Right.
I think the Oromo are going to continue to be a very formidable political force, and as such, I hope that Oromos will raise the concerns of other groups and can speak to the oppression, and can pave the way for how we can bring to the table all the voices and all the perspectives that have been suppressed, under the hegemonic Ethiopian, Ethiopia we net, but also under the hegemony of an ethnic minority group.
Mm-hmm.
So this I'm really excited about, because I feel like there is a lot of potential for this. And the Ethiopian government has really shut down the civil society. The civil society in Ethiopia is really, really, really struggling to exist, what remains of it. Same goes for the independent media, same goes for independent scholars, or any platform that sort of wants to create new narratives.
Right.
So I feel like so that leaves the diaspora, if we can play our cards right, in a very important position to at least have the sort of conversations that could help people imagine a different alternative.
Absolutely. Well, we're wrapping up here in our time in the studio, actually.
Yeah.
But I think this was a wonderful beginning of many more conversations that I think we'll have, and we'll be inviting guests on as well. And hopefully I won't be sick next time. If you have ideas for the show or suggestions for guests you'd like to hear, please let us know. You can email us at theodacity@gmail.com, and we're also on Facebook and Twitter at The Odaacity Podcast. Thank you for listening.